Chapter 1. The hammer struck the nail with a jarring metal-sharp ring that vibrated through Amara's forearm, but the cedar beam refused to take it. The wood was soft, a spongy decay that smelled of wet earth and forgotten winters. Amara adjusted her grip, her palms slick with a fine layer of sawdust and cold sweat. She didn't have the luxury of a slow restoration. In her back pocket, the legal notice from the county assessor felt like a brand against her hip, a 30-day ultimatum. If the structure wasn't deemed habitable and the back taxes settled by the end of the month, the house would be condemned and auctioned. The cedar beam wasn't just a piece of lumber. It was a ticking clock, and right now, the clock was rotting. She swung again, slower this time, driving the nail into a firmer knot of wood. The sound echoed too loudly in the hollow shell of the house, a solitary rhythm that felt less like progress and more like a countdown. Every splintered board and sagging joist was a liability, a financial hemorrhage she couldn't afford. She had poured her last remaining savings into the travel and the initial materials, betting everything on the hope that the house held enough intrinsic value to secure a loan. But as she looked around the skeletal room, the house felt less like an asset and more like a predator waiting for her to fail. She stepped back to wipe the sweat from her brow, her gaze falling to the mahogany floorboards. The wood there was different, dark, dense, and polished to a dull sheen despite the decades of neglect. Amara knelt, the grit of the floor biting into her knees. She pressed her thumb against the grain, tracing the swirling patterns of the wood. It was a habit she had carried since childhood, a way to map the world without having to speak to it. As her skin met the mahogany, a sudden glacial vibration surged upward. It wasn't a sound, but a physical cold that bypassed the skin and settled directly into the marrow of her bones, leaving her fingertips numb and tingling as if she had plunged them into a frozen stream. Then the air shifted. The silence of the house didn't break. It opened. A voice, dry and rattling like dead leaves skittering across a porch, leaked from the pores of the floorboards. It wasn't a voice that traveled through the air, but one that resonated through the soles of her boots, bypassing her ears to vibrate directly in her chest. The words were fragmented, stripped of emotion, yet they carried a weight that made the room feel smaller, as if the walls were leaning in to listen. Amara jerked her hand away, her thumb still throbbing with a ghostly chill. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the wood, and stared at the spot. There was nothing there but the mahogany and the drifting mist, yet the vibration lingered in the air, a low-frequency hum that made the hair on her arms stand up. Amara retreated to the kitchen, her movements sparse and hesitant. She kept to the perimeter of the rooms, hugging the walls as if the center of the house had become a lake of deep water. The kitchen was a cavern of peeling paint and rusted iron, where the smell of old grease clung to the ceiling like a permanent stain. She moved with a mechanical precision, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove. She avoided looking at the center of the room, where the floorboards groaned under an invisible weight. Every time she paused, she could hear the house breathing. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of the timber that mirrored her own shallow breaths. She focused on the whistle of the kettle, the one sound in the house that felt honest and uncomplicated. Once the tea was steeped, she turned her attention to the hearth. A stubborn, obsidian-colored stain marred the gray stone of the fireplace, a blotch that looked like a spilled inkwell from a century ago. Amara knelt with a scrub brush and a bucket of lye soap. She worked in silence, the rhythmic scrubbing providing a temporary anchor against the encroaching dread. But as the soap hit the stone, the house didn't just shudder, it convulsed. A wave of oppressive grief, thick and suffocating, radiated from the hearth. It wasn't a thought or a memory, but a physical pressure that slammed into her chest, knocking the wind from her lungs. Amara collapsed backward, her breath hitching in a throat that suddenly felt constricted by invisible hands. She lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the residue of a sorrow that wasn't hers, a crushing, ancestral loneliness that tasted of salt and metal tang. She remained there for a long time, listening to the house settle, the silence now feeling predatory. When the pressure finally eased, she noticed a slight irregularity in the floorboards beneath where she had fallen. A single plank of pine sat a fraction of an inch higher than the rest, as if something beneath it were trying to push its way into the light. Amara reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and pried the board upward with a flathead screwdriver. Tucked into the dust-choked joist was a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked and peeling like dead skin. She opened it carefully, the parchment brittle. The ink had faded to a ghostly brown, but the entries were clear. They weren't accounts of grain or livestock, but a ledger of payments. Her grandfather's handwriting, precise and rigid, detailed sums of money paid to various unnamed individuals over 3 decades. Each entry ended with the same chilling notation, to keep the silence. The realization hit her with a cold clarity. Her grandfather hadn't just left her a house. He had left her a liability, a legacy of hush money and buried secrets. The family home was a vault for something that had been paid for in blood or shame. Amara spent the rest of the evening in a state of numb isolation. She retreated to the small attic space she had claimed as a temporary bedroom, spreading a sleeping bag over the floor. To quiet the noise in her head, she opened her sketchbook and began to draw. She didn't draw the house as it looked now, shattered and gray, but as a skeletal structure, a map of beams and joists. She sketched the load-bearing walls and the pitch of the roof, trying to find the logic in the architecture, searching for a physical explanation for the psychic weight of the place. But as she drew, the auditory echoes returned. The house began to hum a low, discordant chord that vibrated in her teeth, a sound that suggested the building was not a shelter but a recording device, playing back the traumas of those who had lived within its ribs. By the next morning, the mist had thickened, erasing the horizon and leaving the house floating in a sea of white. Amara sought refuge in work, believing that the physical act of restoration could drown out the whispers. She took a sanding block to the heavy oak doorframe of the master bedroom, the grit of the paper singing against the wood. She worked with a focused intensity, her jaw clenched, trying to ignore the feeling that the house was watching her, judging her efforts to scrub away its history. Just as she reached the top hinge, the wood screamed. It was a high-pitched, visceral sound. The sound of a door being slammed shut with such violence that the frame nearly split. The noise was so sudden and so loud that Amara jumped back, the sanding block flying from her hand. She gasped, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her sternum, staring at the door that had remained perfectly still. She froze, her hand instinctively finding the grain of the doorframe, her thumb tracing the oak to ground herself. The silence that followed was heavier than before, a dense, expectant quiet that felt like a held breath. Then, a voice emerged. It didn't come from the walls or the air, but from directly beneath her feet, vibrating through the floorboards with a clarity that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the rattling whisper of the ledger or the grief of the hearth. This voice was soft, youthful, and impossibly familiar, carrying a cadence she had only ever heard in the fragmented stories her mother told in hushed, terrified tones. It was a voice that belonged to a ghost, a sister she had been told had vanished into the earth before she ever learned to speak. Amara, why did you take so long to come home? Chapter 2. And that is why the blackberry jam from the south slope is fundamentally different from the north, Bao said, his hands a blur of motion as he shifted 3 jars of preserves 2 inches to the left. He didn't wait for the old man leaning against the counter to respond. The regular, a man whose skin looked like cured leather and who smelled faintly of wet wool, merely blinked. Bao was in the middle of what he called the Great Reawakening. He believed that if the jars were aligned just so, and the lighting hit the honeypots at the correct angle, the town would simply remember how to be alive again. He moved to the next shelf, his fingers dancing over the labels, rearranging a stack of handmade soaps that smelled of cedar and rain. But beneath the frantic choreography of his hands, there was a tremor. Bao's eyes flickered toward the ledger resting on the counter, the edges frayed and the ink fading. He wasn't just curating a revival, he was fighting a war of attrition. The general store was the only thing keeping his family's name from becoming a footnote in a bankruptcy court. His father had left him the lease, but he had also left him a legacy of invisible debts and whispered promises that the land would eventually provide. If the store failed, Bao wouldn't just lose a business, he would lose the only anchor he had in a town that viewed him as a perpetual optimist, a trait they mistook for naivety. The momentum is shifting, Mr. Henderson. I can feel it in the air. We aren't just selling preserves, we are curating a revival, Bao continued, his voice a rhythmic, melodic stream. He paused only to straighten a display of wool socks, his eyes bright with a frantic kind of hope. He lived in the spaces between the town's breaths, convinced that a little bit of hospitality and a lot of optimism could patch the holes in a dying economy. He leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. Once the mist clears this week, the weekend travelers will see the charm. They'll see the soul of the place, and they'll want a piece of it. We just need one good season, one surge of interest to clear the arrears. Bao stopped mid-sentence. Through the front window, where the glass was wavy and distorted like a frozen lake, a shape emerged from the white void of the mist. It wasn't the drifting organic movement of a local's truck. This was a black sedan, a slab of polished obsidian that sliced through the fog with surgical precision. It glided to the curb and stopped exactly parallel to the concrete, not a fraction of an inch off. The silence that followed the engine's cut was abrupt and heavy, a vacuum that swallowed the hum of the store's old refrigerator. Callum Sterling stepped out of the car. He didn't emerge so much as he deployed. His suit was a charcoal gray that seemed to repel the surrounding dampness, and his posture was a vertical line of absolute rigidity. He didn't look at the mountains or the swirling mist. Instead, his eyes swept across the weathered facade of the general store with a cold, calculating intensity. He wasn't seeing the hand-painted sign or the ivy clinging to the brickwork. He was calculating the cost of demolition per square foot. He checked a slim silver wristwatch, the movement a sharp flick of the wrist that felt like a shutter closing. Bao hurried to the door, his expression shifting instantly into a mask of inclusive warmth, though it felt like a shield he was holding up. He stepped onto the porch, the old wood groaning under his feet. "Welcome. Please, come in. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. I'm Bao, the innkeeper, and, well, a bit of everything around here. Can I get you a coffee? Or perhaps some of the South Slope jam on a fresh scone?" Sterling didn't move toward the door. He remained on the sidewalk, his gaze fixed on a sagging beam above the entryway. "The structural inefficiency of this building is staggering," he said. His voice was clipped, devoid of any regional cadence, sounding more like a readout from a computer than a human greeting. He didn't look at Bao. "The load-bearing capacity of these walls is likely 40% below current safety codes. It is an asset in a state of active decay." Bao's smile didn't vanish, but it tightened, turning into something brittle. "We call that character Mr. Sterling." "Callum Sterling," he replied, finally shifting his eyes to Bao. The look was clinical, as if he were inspecting a smudge on a window. Character is a sentimental term used to describe a lack of maintenance. From a portfolio perspective, this entire block is an underperforming liability. It's an obstacle to the optimization of the town center. He didn't shake Bao's hand. He simply turned and looked back at his car as if the conversation had already reached its logical conclusion. 2 hours later, the town council meeting took place in the basement of the community hall, a room that smelled of damp cardboard and old heating oil. The air was thick with the tension of 20 people who had known each other for 3 generations. Bao stood at the front, his hands gesturing in wide, sweeping arcs. He spoke with a rhythmic passion that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "The general store is not a liability. It is the heartbeat of this village. It is where we trade news, where we support our local farmers, where the very identity of this town is stored in the aisles. If we lose the store, we lose the center of our gravity." Sterling stood up from the back of the room. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stepped forward and clicked a remote, projecting a series of sleek, high-contrast slides onto a bleached bedsheet pinned to the wall. The images were stark, red zones, efficiency gradients, and projected revenue growth. He spoke in a monotone, a steady drone of asset optimization and urban streamlining. "Sentimentality does not pay municipal taxes," Sterling said, his laser pointer dancing across the screen in a precise red dot. "The current infrastructure is an anchor dragging down the region's potential. By converting this quadrant into a luxury wellness retreat, we increase the property value by 400%. We replace decay with design." As the council members murmured, Sterling's tone shifted from clinical to predatory. He let the laser pointer go still. "However, there is the matter of the debt. The town center's outstanding municipal bonds and several private liens have been consolidated. I have acquired the debt. In short, I own the paper that says you owe the money." He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle like silt. "Unless a sum of $2 million is paid in full by the end of the month, the land reverts to the holder of the debt. To me." A gasp rippled through the room, but it was quickly cut short by a sharp, scoffing laugh. Elias, a man whose family had owned the mill for a century, leaned forward. $2 million? That's a fantasy number, Sterling. You can't just walk in here and buy the ground from under us." "I didn't buy the ground, Mr. Thorne," Sterling replied without looking at him. "I bought the obligation. The law does not care about your tenure. It cares about the signature on the bond." Bao stepped forward, his voice cracking. That's impossible. The council hasn't discussed a consolidation of... Sterling silenced him with a single cold look. It wasn't a glare, it was a dismissal. Section 4, paragraph 12 of the Municipal Credit Act allows for the third-party acquisition of delinquent public liens without prior notice to the administrative body. I suggest you review the legalities before you attempt to argue the ethics. He stepped back, his posture as rigid as a tombstone, leaving the room in a stunned, suffocating silence. Bao walked back to the general store in a haze. The mist had thickened again, turning the world into a blur of gray and white, erasing the edges of the buildings. His movements were slow, the constant motion of his hands finally stilled. He felt a strange heaviness in his chest, a pressure that made every breath feel like he was inhaling water. The $2 million figure echoed in his mind, not as a number, but as a wall. A towering, insurmountable slab of concrete that had just dropped between him and his future. As he reached the porch, he stopped. Taped to the front glass, right over the display of blackberry jam, was a crisp, white piece of paper. It was a formal notice of intent, printed in a sharp sans-serif font that looked violently modern against the weathered wood. The ink was still fresh, the edges of the paper perfectly square. Bao reached out, his finger trembling as he touched the cold glass. The clock had officially started ticking, and for the first time in his life, Bao didn't know how to smile his way out of the dark. Chapter 3. The sharp clink of metal on wood sliced through the silence of the hallway, a sound so precise it felt like a needle-piercing fabric. Amara jumped, her thumb slipping across the rough grain of the cedar beam she had been sanding. She spun around to find Fatima al-Zahrani standing in the dim light of the corridor, her small frame swallowed by a heavy wool shawl, the color of wet slate. Fatima wasn't looking at Amara. Instead, she was focused on the wall, her hand raised, tapping a heavy brass ring against the plaster with a rhythmic, insistent cadence. "You are sanding the skin, child, but you are ignoring the bone," Fatima said. Her voice was a dry rasp, like wind moving through dead corn husks. She didn't stop the tapping. Clink. 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 Dot-non. Amara tightened her grip on the sanding block, her knuckles whitening. She didn't like the way Fatima entered a room without knocking, as if the walls were merely suggestions. "I'm just cleaning the trim," Amara replied, her voice soft, trailing off as she looked toward the floorboards where the voice of her sister had echoed only hours before. "The wood is degraded. It needs work." Fatima stopped the ring mid-strike. She turned her head slowly, her eyes clouded with cataracts but possessing a terrifying clarity of focus. "The house is screaming, and you are treating it like a furniture project. You think if you make the surfaces smooth, the noise will stop. But grief is not a splinter you can just sand away. It is the marrow of the house. When you avoid the rot in your heart, the whispers only grow louder to compensate for your silence." Amara stepped back, the smell of cedar dust and old damp clinging to her clothes. She felt a sudden, irrational urge to leave the house entirely, to walk into the mist until the buildings disappeared. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though the sparse quality of her voice betrayed her. She avoided Fatima's gaze, instead focusing on a small, peeling strip of wallpaper near the baseboard. "Do you?" Fatima stepped forward, the brass ring catching the meager light. Without warning, she reached out and gripped Amara's wrist. Her hand was surprisingly strong, the skin like cured leather. Fatima didn't pull her, she guided her, forcing Amara's head forward until her ear was pressed firmly against a cold, shadowed section of the hallway wall. The plaster was ice-cold, leaching the heat from Amara's skin. "Listen," Fatima commanded. At first there was only the oppressive weight of the silence. Then the resonance hit. It wasn't a sound so much as a physical displacement of air. Amara felt a sudden, violent surge of sensory data that didn't belong to the present. The smell of old parchment and metal shark ink flooded her nostrils, thick and cloying. She felt the claustrophobia of a dark, narrow space, the sensation of holding one's breath in a cupboard, the frantic drumming of a heart against a wooden partition, the taste of metal tang in the mouth. Then the resonance shifted. The static cleared, and a voice tore through the memory. Not a ghost, but a distinct, jagged recollection of a conversation. It was her father's voice, younger, strained with a desperation she had never heard in life. "It's not a gift, Elias. It's a debt. If the town finds out we used the store to hide the ledger, they won't just take the house, they'll burn us out of the valley." Amara recoiled, pulling away so sharply she nearly tripped over her own toolkit. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. The memory wasn't just a recording. It was a revelation. Her father had always spoken of the house as a sanctuary, a legacy of honest labor and ancestral pride. To hear him speak of debts, hidden ledgers, and the threat of being burned out shattered the curated image of the man she had spent years mourning. "What was that?" Amara whispered, her voice trembling. "Why is that in the walls?" "The house does not forget the lies told within it," Fatima said, her voice devoid of pity. "It archives the things we are too cowardly to say aloud. Your father didn't leave you a home, Amara. He left you a confession written in timber and stone. The house is not whispering to comfort you. It is demanding that the debt be settled." The air in the hallway suddenly felt too thick to breathe, as if the walls were closing in to squeeze the truth out of her. Amara felt a jolt of nausea. If the house remembered her father's deception, what else was it keeping? Was her sister's voice a memory or a trapped frequency? The idea that the walls were a recording device for the family's failures made the restoration feel less like a project and more like an excavation of a crime scene. "The attic," Fatima said, her voice cutting through Amara's panic. "The house does not keep the map in the walls, it keeps the map in the crown." They climbed the narrow, winding stairs to the attic, where the air was heavy with the scent of desiccated mothballs and ancient dust. The ceiling was a series of steep pitches and dark corners, filled with the skeletal remains of old furniture draped in gray sheets. Fatima led her to a far corner, beneath a sagging rafter, and pointed to a section of the ceiling that sat slightly lower than the rest. "The false ceiling," Fatima noted, tapping the brass ring once more. "The builders of this house were fond of contradictions." Amara reached up, her carpenter's intuition kicking in. She felt for the seam, her fingers tracing the edge of a hidden panel. With a careful pry of her thumb, she released a latch that had been dormant for decades. A heavy piece of oak shifted, sliding aside to reveal a leather cylinder, cracked and gray with age. Inside were architectural blueprints, the vellum yellowed and brittle, smelling of salt and old smoke. Amara spread the drawings across a dusty trunk, her eyes scanning the lines with professional intensity. She traced the perimeter of the home, comparing the internal walls to the exterior shell. Then she stopped. Her finger hovered over a gap, a void in the structural layout that didn't align with the exterior dimensions of the house. There was a space, a narrow corridor of dead air, that existed within the walls but had no door, no window, and no designated purpose. She followed the line of the void as it traveled downward, cutting through the foundation and extending outward beneath the soil of the yard. Her heart gave a strange, heavy thud as she traced the line to its terminus. The void didn't end at the property line. It extended straight through the earth, terminating exactly beneath the floorboards of the town's general store. Amara looked up at Fatima, her expression vacant with confusion. "The house is connected to the store? Physically?" "This isn't on any of the municipal records I saw. Why would a residential home have a subterranean link to a commercial building? Why was this erased?" Fatima's face shifted, the wrinkles deepening as her expression turned grim. She withdrew her hand, the brass ring falling silent against her side. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked away, her gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in a sliver of light. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of a shared town-wide secret. Amara turned back to the blueprints, her eyes catching a smudge of ink in the margin. It wasn't a technical note or a measurement. It was a handwritten sentence, the script elegant but hurried, as if the writer had been interrupted. "The trust is bound by the blood of the house and the breath of the store." Amara read the words aloud, the sound of her own voice feeling foreign in the quiet attic. As she spoke, the house seemed to settle, a low groan of timber echoing through the walls, as if the building itself had been waiting for those specific words to be uttered. The connection wasn't just structural, it was a covenant. Amara looked at the void on the map and realized that her father's legacy was a tether, binding her not just to a house, but to the very secrets that Nikolai and the rest of the town were desperate to keep buried. Chapter 4. "It is not a boutique, Bao. It is a business," Nikolai said, his voice a flat line that refused to bend. He was leaned back in a heavy oak chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his boots resting on a counter scarred by decades of spilled flour and rusted nails. He didn't look at Bao. He looked at a ledger open on his lap, the pages yellowed and curling. "The bank doesn't accept soul as a form of currency. We are 3 months behind on the land tax, and the municipal council is already eyeing this lot for the new transit hub. If we don't pivot, we aren't just losing a store, we're losing the deed to the soil." Bao was in constant motion, his hands fluttering as he rearranged a display of local honey jars for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The jars clinked rhythmically, a frantic percussion to his optimism. The soul of this place is in the slow things, Nikolai. If we turn the general store into a vending machine for hikers, we lose the heartbeat of the village. We provide sanctuary, not just inventory. He turned sharply as the bell above the door chimed, his face lighting up with a desperate sort of hope. Amara, you're here. Please tell him. Tell him that the integrity of a place matters more than the turnover rate of a beverage cooler. Amara stopped just inside the threshold, the smell of old cedar and dried peppermint enveloping her. She didn't look at Bao, nor did she look at Nikolai. Instead, her gaze drifted to the ceiling, where a water stain shaped like a bruised lung spread across the plaster. She felt the familiar urge to retreat, her shoulders pulling inward, her thumb instinctively tracing the rough grain of the tool belt slung low on her hips. She didn't speak, she simply stood there, listening to the house breathe. The store felt tired, the timber groaning under a weight that wasn't entirely physical, as if the building itself were bracing for an impact. She's a carpenter, not a consultant, Nikolai drawled, finally looking up. His eyes were hard, shadowed by a fatigue that went deeper than lack of sleep. Unless she's come to tell us that the building is structurally unsound, which, given the lean of the front porch, is a fairly safe bet. Which would be convenient, actually. A condemned building is easier to liquidate than a failing business. Bao practically lunged toward her, his voice dropping into a pleading rhythmic cadence. Amara, the porch is sagging. It's a hazard, yes, but it's also a deterrent. No one wants to step onto a deck that looks like it's trying to return to the earth. If you could just brace the supports, give it that stability you have with your hands, we could actually invite people in. We could make it a destination again. Please. I can't pay a contractor from the city, and you understand how wood remembers things. Amara shifted her weight. She didn't like the way Bao looked at her, as if she were a miracle worker rather than a woman who just wanted to be left alone with her saws. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small charcoal pencil and a scrap of vellum. Without a word, she knelt by the doorframe and began to sketch the angle of the slope, her lines precise and sparse. She didn't offer a verbal agreement, she simply handed the sketch to Bao, a series of clipped notations indicating where the joists had failed. It was a nod, a contract written in graphite. Nikolai let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. Wonderful. We're patching a sinking ship with a few nails and a prayer. If we are going to actually fix this place, Amara, why stop at the porch? Let's gut the interior. Tear out these rotting shelves, strip the walls to the studs, and create an open concept layout for maximum efficiency. We can optimize the flow of traffic. He leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave, suddenly intense. My grandfather spent 40 years in this store, and he died with nothing but a collection of rusted keys and a debt to the town. I will not let this building swallow me the way it swallowed him. We strip it, we modernize it, or we burn it down for the insurance. Amara felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation. She didn't look at him, but her pencil snapped in her fingers. She didn't like the word gut. To her, a building wasn't a layout to be optimized. It was a living record. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked past Nikolai without acknowledging him. The air between them felt thick, like static before a storm, the friction of Bao's relentless hope rubbing against Nikolai's cold ancestral trauma until the room felt combustible. She stepped out onto the porch. The wood was gray, bleached by a century of mountain mist and salt. As she knelt to examine the main support beam, she felt the store's presence, a low, humming vibration that resided just below the frequency of hearing. She reached for her heavy mallet and a thick steel brace. The work was grounding. The physical resistance of the wood provided a boundary between her and the suffocating tension inside the store. She focused on the grain, the way the oak had twisted over time to accommodate the shifting soil. As Amara drove the first brace into the main support beam, a violent, rhythmic thrumming suddenly surged beneath her boots. It wasn't a tremor of the earth, but a pulse. It was a heavy, subterranean heartbeat, rhythmic and insistent. Her breath hitched. The vibration was identical to the resonance she had felt in the attic of her own home, the same frequency, the same desperate, searching quality. The two buildings were not merely neighbors. They were speaking to one another through the bedrock, a conversation of stone and root. The resonance peaked in a sudden, blinding crescendo. A sound like a gunshot ripped through the quiet of the afternoon, a loud, ominous crack that seemed to originate from the very center of the floorboards. The store shuddered violently. Above her, a section of the ornate plaster ceiling gave way, a heavy chunk of debris crashing down with a roar of white dust. It slammed into the floorboards inches from where Bao had been standing, spraying him in a cloud of gypsum and ancient lime. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Bao stood frozen, his eyes wide, a streak of white dust crossing his cheek like war paint. Nikolai had finally moved. He was standing now, his arms dropped to his sides, his face pale. The cynical mask had slipped, replaced by a raw, instinctive vulnerability. He studied the hole in the ceiling, then at the floor, as if realizing for the first time that the logic of blueprints and ledgers did not account for the things that live in the marrow of a building. Amara didn't move. She remained kneeling, her hands still pressed firmly against the main support beam. The vibration hadn't stopped. It had shifted into a whisper. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears, but a pressure against her palm, a cold current of information flowing from the wood into her skin. The house was warning her. It was a voice that sounded like grinding stones and shifting silt, ancient and terrified. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the rough timber, feeling the hidden corridor beneath the earth screaming in sympathy with the collapse. The structural failure wasn't an accident of age or neglect. It was a reaction. The building was reacting to the threat of erasure, to the very idea of gutting the memory of the place. It was a violent rejection of Nikolai's desire to wipe the slate clean. Bao cleared his throat, his voice trembling. "Amara, what happened? Was it the wind? The foundation?" Amara slowly pulled her hand away from the wall, her fingers trembling. She studied the wreckage of the ceiling and then at the terrified man beside her. She didn't know how to tell him that the building was mourning. She didn't know how to explain that the store was not a business, but a limb of her own home. "The foundation is not stone," Amara said, her voice sparse and hollow. "It is a secret." Chapter 5. The basement of the general store smelled of damp slate and the sharp tang of old nails, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like wet wool. Amara stepped over a pile of rotting burlap sacks, her boots clicking softly against the concrete, until she saw the light. A small, battery-powered lantern sat on a makeshift table of stacked crates, casting a harsh white circle over a series of vellum sheets. Sunita was there, hunched over the paper, her pencil moving in frantic, jagged strokes. She wasn't just sketching, she was attacking the page, her hand blurring as she traced the subterranean lines of the foundation with a hunger that looked like fever. Amara stopped a few feet away, her thumb instinctively finding the grain of a nearby support tiller. The wood felt cold, humming with the leftover trauma of the ceiling's collapse, but beneath that was a deeper vibration, a low, rhythmic thrum that felt less like architecture and more like a heartbeat. She didn't speak for a long time, watching the way Sunita's glasses slipped down the bridge of her nose, never once pushed back up. The air in the basement was thick, tasting of limestone and something older, a scent like pressed flowers kept in a heavy book for 50 years. "You're not supposed to be down here," Amara said. Her voice was a low thread, barely cutting through the silence of the cellar. Sunita jumped, her pencil skidding across the vellum with a sharp screech. She spun around, clutching the sketchbook to her chest like a shield, her eyes wide behind the thick lenses. "I'm surveying!" she exclaimed, the words tumbling out in a rapid-fire cascade. "I mean, technically I am. Nikolai hired me to survey. He wants the load-bearing capacities, the soil density, the whole clear-cut checklist, so he can figure out exactly how much pressure the ground can take before the whole block sinks. He doesn't want to save the store, Amara. He wants to know exactly where to place the demolition charges so the rubble doesn't spill into the street and delay the new development." Amara moved closer, her gaze drifting to the sketches. They were precise, professional, but there were red ink marks scattered across them, question marks and exclamation points that looked like wounds on the page. Demolition? He told the council he was considering a restoration. "A lie to keep the zoning board quiet," Sunita said, her voice accelerating. "But look at this. The math doesn't work. The geometry of this place is lying to me." "Lying how?" "The void," Sunita said, her gestures wide and erratic. "There's a displacement in the earth. According to the municipal records, this basement is a solid slab. But the sonic readings I took yesterday show a hollow. A massive, intentional hollow. It's a vacuum in the middle of the bedrock, a space that shouldn't exist unless someone spent a decade digging by hand in total secrecy. It's beautiful. It's absolutely terrifying. I can't sleep because I keep thinking about the volume of air sitting beneath us, just waiting." Sunita stepped away from the table, her eyes darting to the damp walls with a mixture of reverence and disgust. "Nikolai wants to pour concrete. He wants to fill every gap with sterile gray cement and call it stabilization. He doesn't see the architecture, he sees a liability." He sees a cost center. I can't let him just erase it. You can't just pour concrete over a secret and pretend the ground isn't screaming. Amara watched the younger woman, noting the tremor in her fingers. This wasn't corporate ambition. It was a different kind of obsession. It was the same pull Amara felt when she touched the walls of her own home, the feeling that the buildings were not objects, but vessels. For a moment, the distance between the reserved carpenter and the frantic architect vanished, replaced by a shared, quiet horror at the idea of a world made smooth and silent. Sunita hesitated, then slowly slid a separate sheet of heavy parchment across the crates. It wasn't a corporate survey. It was a rendering, hand-drawn in charcoal and ink, showing a vein of darkness stretching out from the store's foundation. The line traveled deep, curving through the loam and schist, until it terminated exactly beneath the floorboards of Amara's ancestral home. Amara reached out, her thumb rubbing the rough texture of the paper. As she traced the path of the tunnel, a sudden spike of vertigo hit her. She wasn't just looking at a map, she was feeling the draft of a subterranean wind. She remembered the void she had sensed in the blueprints in the attic, the missing space that felt like a held breath. This was it, the physical manifestation of a covenant. The house and the store were not merely neighbors. They were joined at the hip, sharing a secret artery of stone and shadow. It is a root, Amara thought, the realization echoing in the hollow of her chest. The house isn't just a building, it's the anchor, and the store is the blossom. If Nikolai cuts the root, the blossom dies. But what happens to the anchor when the connection is severed? Do I become a ghost in my own hallway? It's not just a corridor, Sunita whispered, noticing Amara's intensity. Her voice had slowed, losing its frantic edge. I've spent 3 nights in the archives. There are mentions in the old diaries, not the official ones, the ones kept by the midwives and the cobblers. They talk about the residue. They say that when the town couldn't bear the weight of certain memories, the shames, the griefs, the things that would break a family, they whispered them into the walls of the tunnel. The tunnel isn't just dirt and stone, Amara. It's a repository. It's where the town put everything it wanted to forget. Amara pulled her hand away from the map as if the paper had turned hot. The idea of a physical space filled with the town's discarded grief made the air in the basement feel heavier, more viscous. She studied Sunita, and for the first time she didn't see a stranger or a corporate tool. She saw a fellow guardian. But the map was not a gift, it was a puzzle. As Amara looked closer, she realized the charcoal lines were fragmented. There were gaps in the tunnel's path, sections where the ink blurred into illegible smears. The map didn't show how to enter the void, it only showed that the void existed. To find the entrance, she would have to decode the architecture of the house and the store in tandem, treating the 2 buildings as a single, broken machine. We can't let him find it, Amara said, her voice steadying. If he finds the tunnel, he won't just fill it. He'll use it to leverage the land. He'll turn the town's secrets into a line item on a balance sheet. He'll hold the town's history hostage. Sunita nodded fervently, a small, determined smile touching her lips. I've already skewed the official reports. I told him the soil was unstable and would require a slow burn assessment. I bought us a few days, but he's losing patience. He doesn't like waiting for the earth to speak. Their moment of alliance was shattered by a sound that vibrated through the ceiling, a deep, mechanical rumble that shook the jars of preserves on the shelves above. It was the sound of heavy machinery, the guttural roar of a diesel engine idling in the street. Amara hurried to the small high window of the basement, squinting through the grime. Outside, a fleet of white surveying trucks had lined the curb, their chrome surfaces gleaming with a sterile, predatory brightness. In the center of the road stood Nikolai. He looked like a surgical instrument in a tailored gray suit, his posture rigid, his expression one of profound boredom. He wasn't looking at the buildings, he was looking at his wrist, his thumb clicking a stopwatch with a rhythmic, metal-sharp snap. He was standing exactly where the map indicated the tunnel's primary ventilation shaft lay hidden beneath the cobblestones, his heel pressing down on the secret as if he already owned the silence beneath his feet. He didn't just want the land, he was standing on the town's throat, waiting for it to stop breathing. Chapter 6. Bao stood atop a weathered cider crate, his voice cutting through the damp air with a rhythmic, urgent cadence. He had spent the morning arranging the square, polishing the brass railing of the town's central fountain, and scrubbing the grime from the cobblestones, as if a cleaner environment could invite a cleaner kind of hope. He spoke of the general store not as a business, but as a living lung, the place where the town breathed together. His hands moved in wide, inclusive arcs, trying to pull the scattered residents into a singular, cohesive circle. He spoke of the old stories, the way the store had sheltered them during the Great Frost, and the way the floorboards of the village center held the echoes of 1,000 shared secrets. But the crowd was thin, a sparse collection of figures draped in heavy wool and gray shawls. They didn't look at Bao. They looked at the mist that clung to their boots like wet fleece. Their eyes were vacant, mirroring the apathy of the fog. There was a heaviness in their shoulders that no amount of Bao's optimism could lift. He could see the way they shifted their weight, the way they avoided the gaze of their neighbors, their faces etched with a fatigue that went deeper than a lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of people who had forgotten how to want something better. "We are not just selling parcels of dirt," Bao called out, his voice cracking slightly on the high note. "We are selling the ground our grandfathers walked on. If we let the center go, we aren't just losing a store, we are losing the mirror that tells us who we are." He paused, waiting for a murmur of agreement, a single nod, a spark of defiance. Instead, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of a diesel engine. The sound arrived before the man did, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle the teeth of everyone standing in the square. Then, from the veil of white mist, Callum Sterling emerged. He didn't walk so much as glide, his gray suit a sharp, sterile blade cutting through the softness of the mountain morning. He carried a leather briefcase that looked as though it had never touched a dusty surface in its life. He didn't interrupt, he simply stopped 10 feet from the podium, his posture rigid, his thumb clicking the side of his slim wristwatch with a metal-sharp, precise snap. Sterling didn't lead with a threat. He didn't mention the debts or the municipal leverage. Instead, he opened the briefcase with a slow, deliberate motion and produced a stack of sleek, cream-colored folders. He didn't shout. He spoke in a clipped, corporate tone that felt like a cold wind. "I believe in efficiency," Sterling said, his voice devoid of any regional warmth, "and I believe that the residents of this valley have been paying a tax on nostalgia for far too long. Inside these folders are relocation packages. Not just payouts, but guaranteed housing in the lower valley, comprehensive health stipends, and a lump sum that ensures no one here will have to worry about a heating bill for the next decade." The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. It wasn't a gradual change, but a sudden snap, like a frozen branch breaking under the weight of snow. The vacant eyes of the residents suddenly ignited. The apathy vanished, replaced by a hunger that was almost predatory. They didn't move toward Bao, they surged toward Sterling. The circle Bao had painstakingly tried to build collapsed inward, the people crowding around the developer, their shoulders brushing against one another in a frantic, silent competition for the folders. "Wait," Bao shouted, stepping down from the crate. His voice felt small now, a pebble thrown into a deep well. "You can't put a price on the heart of a town. Look at the store. Look at the history. History doesn't put food on the table, Bao," a voice barked. It was Elias, a man whose family had lived in the valley for 3 generations, now stepping forward to shield his folder from the crowd. His face was twisted, not with greed, but with a desperate, jagged kind of fear. "We've been starving in this heart for 20 years. You talk about mirrors, but all I see in the mirror is a man who can't afford his medicine. Sterling is offering a way out. Why are you trying to keep us trapped in a graveyard?" The crowd murmured in agreement, a low, guttural sound of resentment. The loyalty that Bao had assumed was the bedrock of the community evaporated. It was as if Sterling had offered them a way to buy back their youth, or at least a way to stop the slow leak of their lives. From the periphery, Nikolai Volkov leaned against a damp brick wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He watched the scene with a dry, clinical detachment, a ghost of a smirk on his lips. He had seen this coming since the first day he'd audited the store's crumbling ledgers. When Bao caught his eye, desperate for a shred of support, Nikolai let out a long, audible sigh. "Hope is a beautiful thing, Bao," Nikolai said, his monotone voice cutting through the noise of the shuffling crowd. "But hope doesn't pay the heating bill in January. You're fighting a ghost with a smile, while Sterling is fighting with gold. The gold always wins. Besides, some of us know exactly what this town is hiding under its floorboards, and believe me, a clean slate is the only mercy this place deserves." Bao didn't answer. He couldn't. He felt a sudden crushing weight in his chest, as if the atmosphere of the town had physically condensed and settled on his ribs. He backed away from the fray, his movements clumsy, until he found a wrought iron chair near the fountain. He collapsed into it, his strength vanishing. He steadied his hands, the hands that had spent weeks polishing brass and scrubbing stones, and saw that they were shaking. He had tried to carry the spirit of the village on his own shoulders, and he had finally reached the point where the burden broke him. He felt a profound, hollow silence opening up inside him, a void where his optimism had once lived. Sterling, seeing the victory complete, stepped away from the group of siding residents. He walked toward Bao with a slow, predatory grace. He didn't look triumphant. He looked bored, as if he were merely completing a tedious administrative task. He leaned in close, the scent of expensive cologne and sterile air clinging to him. "You have a romantic soul," Mr. Rao clinging to him. "Nguyen," Sterling whispered, his voice a cold sliver of ice. "But romance is a luxury for those who don't have to calculate the cost of survival." "You spoke of the heart of this town. I'm afraid you're too late. The heart has already stopped beating. It just hasn't realized it's dead yet." Amara had been watching from the shadows of a recessed doorway, her thumb tracing the rough grain of a wooden pillar. She hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, but she felt the shift in the earth beneath her boots. As the residents signed the contracts, as the ink dried on the cream-colored paper, the resonance in the ground changed. It was no longer a whisper or a melancholic hum. It became a scream. It was a high, vibrating frequency that didn't reach the ears but resonated in the marrow of her bones. The ground beneath the square felt unstable, not physically, but emotionally. It was as if the very soil were reacting to the betrayal, the ancestral memory of the land recoiling from the erasure of its people. Amara looked down and saw thin, jagged cracks spiderwebbing across the cobblestones, beginning exactly where Sterling stood and racing toward the general store. It wasn't a geological fault, it was a fracture of the spirit, and as the scream in the earth intensified, Amara realized that the secrets buried in the tunnel were no longer content to stay hidden. Chapter 7. The iron rung of the ladder groaned under Amara's weight, a metal shark shriek that echoed upward into the attic and vanished into the throat of the earth. She descended slowly, her flashlight cutting through a mist that clung to the air like wet wool. It smelled of cedar heartwood and the suffocating damp of a place forgotten by the sun. Every step deeper was a step away from the town's fractured square and into a silence so heavy it pressed against her eardrums like deep water. As she stepped onto the packed dirt floor, the light caught the walls. They were lined with an iridescent mineral that shimmered with a rhythmic pulse. The resonance she had felt in the square was here, but it had shifted from a scream to a thrum, a low-frequency vibration that bypassed her ears and settled into the marrow of her shins. She took a step forward, and the tunnel exhaled. It wasn't air that hit her, but a psychic wave of raw grief. The walls became translucent, flashing with images. A woman in a high-collared dress weeping over a letter, two men fighting in the rain, their faces distorted by a betrayal as sharp as a blade. These were residues, the emotional shrapnel of a century of townspeople. But the house did not offer these memories as a gift. It thrust them at her like an accusation. The grief was a viscous syrup that filled the tunnel, tasting of salt and old metal, threatening to drown her in a history she hadn't earned the right to carry. She slammed her shoulder against the damp wall to steady herself, but the contact only amplified the transmission. The house seemed to seize her, the resonance shifting from general grief to something surgical and cruel. A memory flared, her grandfather gaunt and gray, staring at a ledger with shaking hands. She saw the ink-stained pages of a bankruptcy so absolute it had erased his name from the local registries. She felt the crushing pressure of a legacy built on a lie of incompetence. "I am just the daughter of a ghost who couldn't balance a book," she thought, her internal voice spiking into a jagged rhythm. "I can plane a door until it's silk, but I cannot carve a way out of a bloodline that breaks under pressure. I am just another layer of varnish over a rotting beam. Itchy." The house leaned into the thought, amplifying the vertigo until the tunnel tilted. The walls seemed to contract, the iridescent mineral pulsing a mocking, rhythmic red. It was a psychological vice, squeezing the air from her lungs, demanding she admit her own insignificance before it would let her pass. For a moment, the weight of the earth above her felt like a physical hand pushing her down, urging her to curl into a ball on the dirt and let the silence swallow her whole. But as the panic peaked, Amara did the only thing she knew how to do when a structure was failing. She stopped fighting the current and started listening for the frequency. She closed her eyes, ignoring the flashing images of failure, and focused on the vibration in her bones. She treated the grief like a warped piece of timber, something that could be understood, clamped, and corrected. She looked for the grain, the steady line of truth beneath the distortion. She breathed in time with the pulsing walls, refusing to be a victim of the house's mood, until the noise of shame receded, leaving behind a thin, silver thread of fierce, protective longing. Following that thread, Amara pushed deeper into the narrowing corridor. The ceiling dipped until she had to hunch her shoulders, the air growing colder, smelling of ozone and ancient ink. Then the tunnel opened into a circular alcove. In the center, resting on a stone plinth, sat a rusted iron box. Amara knelt, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. The hinge let out a dry, metal-sharp gasp that sounded like a warning. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of letters and a parchment document with a heavy wax seal. It wasn't a simple deed of sale. It was a community trust deed dated 1892. The language was archaic but clear. The general store and the surrounding land were established as a perpetual trust to ensure the village's survival. The store was a communal organ, and the deed forbade the sale of the land to any entity that did not serve the collective well-being of the residents. Amara picked up the letters, the paper thin as onion skin. They were correspondences between the founders discussing the blood covenant of the hearth, a promise that the town's heart would be guarded by those who lived in the ancestral home. Her family hadn't just owned a house, they had been the stewards of the town's legal soul. The bankruptcy and exile weren't just personal failures, they were a breach of a sacred guardianship. The hollowness in her chest began to fill, not with a convenient solution, but with a heavy, daunting responsibility. She wasn't just a carpenter fixing a roof, she was the missing piece of a structural puzzle, and the debt she inherited was far larger than any financial sum. When she turned to leave, the vertigo was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She tucked the iron box under her arm and began the climb. However, as she reached the final stretch, the light from the attic was suddenly obscured. A heavy metal-sharp clatter echoed down the shaft, the sound of something massive and industrial. Amara paused, shining her light upward. A tripod and surveying instruments. Sterling's equipment had been positioned over the opening. A reinforced steel plate had been slid across the hatch, sealing the exit with a finality that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Sterling wasn't just surveying the land for Nikolai, he was actively burying the evidence of the town's autonomy. He had timed the seal to trap her, or at the very least, to ensure that whatever she found stayed in the dark. Amara didn't panic. She felt the resonance of the house above her, a welcoming vibration that felt like a hand on her shoulder. She heaved her shoulder against the steel plate, the metal shrieking against stone. It was a brutal, physical struggle, her boots slipping on the rungs as she fought the weight of the plate. With a final, guttural effort that tore at the muscles of her back, she shoved the plate aside and squeezed through, sliding into the attic, gasping for air. Fatima was standing there, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the window. She wasn't looking at the equipment or the displaced plate. She was looking directly at Amara, her gaze heavy and knowing. Her hand rested on a wooden beam, but for the first time her brass ring was silent. "The earth has a long memory, Amara," Fatima said, her voice a dry rasp like wind through autumn leaves. "And it is very selective about who it chooses to whisper to. You didn't just find a paper, you woke up a debt." Amara looked down at the iron box, then back at the old woman. The silence between them was full of the weight of the ghosts they had just awakened. Outside, in the square, the fracture in the cobblestones began to widen, a thin line of gold light bleeding upward from the depths, signaling that the secrets were no longer content to stay buried, and the fight for the store had just become a war for the town's identity. Chapter 8. The iron box hit the mahogany council table with a sound like a closing casket. Dust motes, disturbed by the impact, danced in the shafts of afternoon light that pierced the gloom of the town hall. Bao stood over the box, his chest heaving, his fingers trembling as they gripped the edge of the lid. He didn't look at the 5 council members seated behind the curved dais. He fixed on the box as if it were a living thing that might suddenly breathe and speak the truth for him. "This is it," Bao said, his voice cracking under the weight of a dozen sleepless nights. "The trust deed. The actual physical proof that the general store and the historic center aren't just assets to be liquidated. They are bound by a covenant, a legal and spiritual guardianship that predates every municipal debt Sterling is claiming." He flung the lid open. Inside, resting on a bed of decayed velvet, was a roll of parchment tied with a cord of braided human hair and silver thread. The council members leaned forward, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated skepticism. The council head, a man named Elias, whose skin looked like cured leather, reached out with a shaking hand to unfurl the document. The ink was a strange, iridescent violet, the script looping and archaic, flowing across the page in a way that seemed to shift if one looked at it from the corner of the eye. Callum Sterling didn't move. He remained leaned against the back wall, his posture a rigid line of corporate efficiency. He didn't look at the deed, he watched his wristwatch, a slim piece of platinum that caught the light. He waited for the silence to stretch, allowing the council's doubt to ripen. "A fascinating piece of folk art," Sterling said, his voice clipped and precise, devoid of any regional warmth. "Truly, in a museum, this would be a delightful curiosity. But let us be adults about the reality of the situation. We are discussing 21st century municipal law, not a scavenger hunt for family heirlooms." He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "This document lacks a notary stamp, a modern registration number, and any semblance of a legal framework recognized by the state. It is a poem, at best. A fantasy, at worst." Bao's face flushed a deep crimson. He stepped toward Sterling, his hands gesturing wildly. "It's not a poem. It's the foundation of this town. You can't just erase a century of guardianship because it doesn't fit into a spreadsheet." Sterling finally pushed off the wall, stepping into the circle of light. He didn't raise his voice, he lowered it, creating an intimacy that felt like a threat. "Bao, your passion is admirable if misplaced. But we must ask why this suddenly appears. Why now? And more importantly, where did it come from?" He turned his gaze toward Amara, who was standing in the shadow of the doorway. "The Okafor family has a storied history in this valley, certainly. But it is also a history of instability, disappearances, emotional collapses, a legacy of people who saw things that weren't there and heard voices in the walls." Amara felt the air in the room thicken, turning into something viscous and hard to swallow. She wanted to speak, to tell him that the voices weren't hallucinations but the architecture of memory, but her throat felt as though it had been sewed shut with heavy twine. She retreated a half step, her thumb instinctively finding the grain of the doorframe, tracing the rough, honest texture of the oak to keep herself grounded. Sterling's eyes locked onto her, a predator noting the exact moment the prey froze. "Look at her," Sterling said softly, gesturing to Amara's rigid posture. "The silence of the Okafor bloodline is telling. If this document were a legitimate legal instrument, it would have been filed in the county archives, not buried in a box in a dusty attic by a family known for its fragile grip on reality. You are asking this council to gamble the town's financial solvency on the word of a woman who cannot even look you in the eye." Elias, the council head, sighed, the sound echoing through the vaulted ceiling. He looked from the violet ink of the deed to the sterile, polished shoes of Sterling. The logic of the modern world was a heavy hammer, and the council members were tired of holding up the shield. "Mr. Sterling makes a compelling point regarding the legal standing," Elias admitted, his voice heavy with a reluctant sort of pragmatism. "The document is interesting. It suggests a history we may have forgotten. But in the eyes of the law, a deed is only as good as its registration. We cannot halt a multi-million-dollar development based on a piece of parchment that looks like it was written by a medium." "It's the truth," Bao shouted, his voice echoing. "The house, Amara's house, it knows, the town knows. The town is a collection of buildings, Bao," Sterling replied coldly, "and buildings can be replaced." Elias cleared his throat, the sound final. "We acknowledge the sentiment, but we cannot act on sentiment. Unless there is physical, tangible proof, not a piece of paper, but an active, functioning manifestation of this trust, we have no choice. The debts are overdue. The luxury retreat is the only path to solvency." Amara's hand was still on the wood of the doorframe, but the sensation had changed. The wood wasn't just rough, it was vibrating. It was a low, humming frequency that started in the soles of her boots and climbed up her spine. She studied the mahogany table, the very table where the council sat. She could feel the resonance of the room reacting to Sterling's lie. The table wasn't just furniture, it was a witness. The mahogany began to thrum, a rhythmic pulsing that matched the heartbeat of the house she had spent months restoring. She tried to open her mouth to tell them that the earth beneath their feet was screaming, but the social anxiety locked her jaw tight. She felt a bead of sweat roll down her temple. She saw Sterling smirk, a small, triumphant curl of the lip that told her he knew exactly how to dismantle her. "The verdict is reached," Elias announced, his voice devoid of emotion. He didn't look at Bao. He didn't look at Amara. He studied the clock on the wall. "Without tangible proof of the trust's active existence, the deed is declared void for the purposes of this proceeding. The sale is finalized." Bao collapsed into a chair, the wind leaving him in one long, shuddering exhale. He looked smaller, the optimism that usually radiated from him extinguished like a blown candle. Demolition of the non-essential structures in the historic center, Elias continued, will begin tomorrow at dawn. Mr. Outwer. Sterling, you may proceed with the clearing of the site. As Sterling turned to leave, he paused beside Amara. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in, his scent of expensive cologne and sterile static crackle filling her senses. Some things are better left buried, Miss Okafor, he whispered. The ghosts of your ancestors are poor lawyers. He walked out, the click of his heels on the marble floor sounding like the ticking of a countdown. Amara remained frozen, her hands still pressed against the wood. As the council members began to shuffle their papers and discuss the logistics of the demolition, Amara felt a sudden sharp spike in the vibration. Below the floorboards, deep in the belly of the town hall, something shifted. A sound like a subterranean groan rippled through the foundation, so subtle that only someone who listened to the bones of buildings could hear it. It wasn't a collapse, it was an awakening. The gold light that had begun to bleed into the town square was no longer a thin line. It was pulsing, rhythmic and hungry, flowing through the soil toward the foundations of the hall, seeking the breach that Sterling had tried to seal. Chapter 9. The chair shrieked against the marble, a jagged metal-sharp sound that sliced through the suffocating silence of the hall. Amara didn't just stand. She rose as if pushed by a current beneath the floor, a sudden surge of kinetic energy that left her fingertips tingling. Her palms were still damp, her thumb tracing the ghost of a wood grain that wasn't there. But for the first time in 10 years, the silence in her throat felt less like a wall and more like a reservoir ready to burst. Nikolai didn't turn immediately. He remained leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of calculated indifference, though his eyes remained fixed on the iron box resting on the mahogany table. Beside him, Sterling, the corporate architect of the town's modernization, was checking the slim silver face of his watch. His posture was a rigid line of corporate certainty, his presence a sterile vacuum that sought to suck the oxygen out of the room. He began to speak, his voice a clipped sequence of syllables designed to streamline the room into a ledger. The logistical imperatives of the retreat are clear, Councilman, Sterling said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. The inefficiency of the current layout is a liability. We are talking about an optimization of space, a removal of the decaying structures that act as a blight on the town's potential. The general store is a carcass. The ancestral home is a ruin. To preserve them is to prioritize nostalgia over survival. The house is not a layout, Amara said. Her voice was low, barely above a murmur, yet it carried a strange, resonant weight that seemed to displace the air. It wasn't the loud, commanding tone of a politician. It was the sound of a beam settling into its notch, a sound of structural truth. Sterling stopped mid-sentence, his head tilting with a flicker of annoyance. He fixed on her as if she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly moved an inch to the left. "I'm sorry?" Sterling asked, his tone dripping with a polished, sterile condescension. Amara didn't look at his eyes. She studied the mahogany table, the witness. She closed her eyes and felt the subterranean groan she had sensed in the basement, the gold light, the blood covenant, the humming architecture of the town. She knew the iron box held the proof of the town's original charter, but she also knew the poison pill it contained, the revelation that the town's founding wealth had been built on a betrayal of the very families now sitting on the council. To use the box was to win the store, but it was also to strip the council of their pride and the town of its sanitized history. She didn't argue the law or the deed, those were Sterling's weapons, and she had no interest in fighting on his terrain. Instead, she leaned her weight into the floor, imagining her feet as roots sinking through the marble, through the concrete, into the damp, cedar-scented earth below. "You speak of assets," she said, her voice gaining a rhythmic steadiness. "But you can't hear the way the town breathes. The general store isn't just a building, it's a lung. The ancestral home is the heart. They are connected by a vein of stone and memory that you've tried to erase from the maps. But you cannot erase the resonance." As she spoke, she consciously amplified the vibration. She didn't use a spell, she simply stopped resisting the hum of the room. She became a tuning fork. The air in the hall began to thicken, turning heavy and sweet, smelling of old sawdust, rain-drenched moss, and the sharp metallic tang of a blacksmith's forge from a century ago. It was a sensory deluge, a sudden bloom of ancestral presence that crowded out the sterile scent of Sterling's cologne. Beside her, Bao gasped. He wasn't just listening, he was swaying, his hands frozen in the middle of a nervous gesture. The council members, men and women who had spent the afternoon treating the town like a mathematical problem, suddenly froze. Elias, the council head, gripped the edges of his desk. His knuckles turned white. He wasn't hearing Amara's words so much as he was feeling them in his marrow. The resonance shifted, zooming in on a single, piercing chord of grief. It wasn't a pleasant memory. It was the collective weight of every winter the town had survived, the hunger of the great frost, the funerals held in the general store, and the quiet, desperate prayers of people who had nothing but the wood beneath their feet. It was a physical pressure, a tidal wave of belonging and pain that made the marble floor feel as though it were turning back into living mountain. Sterling's face shifted from annoyance to a flicker of genuine confusion, then to a pale, wide-eyed alarm. He tried to step forward, to reclaim the narrated with a sharp, corrective gesture. This is theatrical nonsense. This is a legal proceeding, not a séance. Councilman Elias, I move that we ignore this emotional outburst and proceed with the demolition schedule. He stopped. His voice cracked. The resonance peaked, a sudden, thunderous thrum that vibrated the glass water carafes on the table until they sang a high, piercing note. Sterling's rigid posture crumbled. He lurched backward, his heel catching on the carpet, his balance betrayed by a floor that suddenly felt fluid and alive. He looked small, a sterile man in a room that had suddenly remembered its own soul. The trust isn't a ghost story, a new voice intervened. Nikolai Volkov stood up. The movement was slow, devoid of his usual cynical haste. He didn't look at Sterling, he watched the iron box. For a moment, his face betrayed a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, or a long-buried longing. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, sliding a set of documents across the mahogany with a decisive snap. I spent the last 3 days auditing the trust's dormant accounts, Nikolai said, his monotone voice having shifted, losing its edge of boredom and gaining a grounded, pragmatic weight. Sterling's valuation is predicated on the assumption that the center is a liability. It isn't. But the preservation isn't about sentiment. It's about leverage. Nikolai looked at the council, his eyes narrowing. The documents in that iron box and the audits I've performed prove that the land titles for half the properties in this room are contingent upon the general store remaining a public utility. If you demolish the store, you don't just lose a building. You trigger a legal cascade that could strip this council of its land rights. The math supports the preservation because the alternative is mutual destruction. The room went cold. The poison pill had been delivered. The victory wasn't a gift of magic or a sudden burst of community spirit. It was a cold, hard realization of shared vulnerability. Amara felt the shift. She had provided the emotional resonance, the reminder of who they were, but Nikolai had provided the kill shot. Bao let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, his hand finding Amara's shoulder. The touch was warm, a human anchor in the swirling scent of cedar and damp earth. Amara felt the vibration in the room begin to settle, not disappearing, but shifting from a scream to a steady, humming peace. The house and the store had entered the room to testify, and they had spoken to the only languages the council understood, the visceral pull of blood and the cold logic of a balance sheet. Elias looked at the documents, then at Sterling, who was still recovering his equilibrium, his face a mask of pale shock. The council head looked aged, as if the resonance had stripped away a layer of professional armor, leaving only a man who remembered the smell of his grandfather's pipe and the way the mist used to cling to the eaves of the town square. He looked at Amara, and for the first time, he didn't see a contractor or a daughter of the town. He saw the person who had forced them all to look at the rot in their own foundations. The verdict, Elias began, his voice trembling slightly, is reversed. The sale is annulled. The demolition order is rescinded. Sterling didn't argue. He couldn't. The resonance had left him feeling hollow, a man who had tried to buy a mountain and found himself crushed by the weight of a single, quiet voice and a few pages of old law. He gathered his briefcase with shaking hands, the click of his heels now sounding fragile and frantic rather than authoritative. As he exited the hall, he didn't look back, leaving behind a room that still smelled of old cedar and a victory that felt like a beginning, though it was a victory bought with a truth that would leave the town forever changed. Amara sank back into her chair, her muscles suddenly turning to water. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a shared silence, a space where the town could finally breathe, even if the air was heavy with the scent of old secrets. But as she traced the grain of the table one last time, she felt a new, sharper vibration. It wasn't a memory. It was a call. Deep beneath the floorboards, the gold light wasn't receding. It was expanding, flowing through the subterranean corridor toward the ancestral home, carrying with it a secret that the victory in the council hall had only just begun to uncover. Chapter 10. The oil felt like honey against the grain, a heavy golden fluid that filled the thirsty pores of the reclaimed maple. Amara moved the rag in long, rhythmic arcs, following the natural flow of the wood. She didn't look up when the bell above the door chimed, nor when the low rumble of voices swelled in the center of the general store. She focused on the way the oil transformed the pale surface into something deep and luminous, a mirror for the amber light filtering through the dusty windows. The counter was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a bridge, a physical anchor for a town that had spent too long drifting in the mist. "It's a masterpiece, Amara." "Truly," Bao said, his voice carrying that familiar melodic warmth. He was standing a few feet away, flanked by a small group of residents. He wasn't hovering or frantically organizing the space as he once had. Instead, he looked relaxed, his shoulders dropped, leaning back against a stack of fresh crates. He looked like a man who had finally stopped trying to hold up the ceiling with his own two hands and realized the beams were strong enough to hold themselves. "It's just maple," Amara replied, her voice soft, though she didn't stop the steady movement of her hand. She traced a knot in the wood, a swirling eye that seemed to watch the room. "It isn't just maple," Nikolai countered, stepping forward. He didn't have his ledger, his hands were empty, hanging loosely at his sides. His tone was still dry, the monotone of a man who lived by the decimal, but the sharp edge of his cynicism had been replaced by a heavy, contemplative stillness. "It's a structural asset. The flow of traffic is optimized. People aren't bottlenecking at the entrance, they're drawn toward the center. It's efficient." He paused, his gaze drifting to the floorboards. "And it's honest. My grandfather helped lay these foundations. I'd forgotten how the grain looked before the linoleum covered it." Amara paused, her thumb resting on a smooth section of the counter. She studied the people gathered around, neighbors who had once spoken in hushed tones about debts and demolition, now arguing gently about where to place the new local produce bins. The air in the store had changed. The oppressive weight of sterling's valuation had evaporated, replaced by the smell of beeswax, peppermint tea, and the scent of wet wool from the rain outside. Outside the window, a flash of polished black steel caught the light. The sedan moved slowly through the square, its engine a muted, sterile hum that felt foreign to the mountain air. Callum Sterling didn't slow down. He didn't look toward the store or the ancestral home. He simply drove, the vehicle slicing through the thickening mist until the taillights were swallowed by the gray, leaving behind a silence that felt like a long-held breath finally released. He hadn't been defeated by a legal technicality, but by a resonance he couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet. He had tried to buy a ghost town and discovered that the ghost had a stronger claim to the land than he did. Amara left the store as the sun began to dip, casting long violet shadows across the cobblestones. The walk back to her ancestral home felt shorter than it ever had before. The mist didn't feel like a shroud anymore. It felt like a blanket. When she stepped through the front door, the house didn't greet her with the frantic, vibrating anxiety of the previous weeks. There were no sudden temperature drops, no sudden gusts of wind in closed hallways. She spent the afternoon in the hearth room. The fireplace was a cavern of soot and old ash, a cold mouth that had been silent for decades. Amara knelt on the stone floor, scrubbing the grate with a stiff brush. The movements were fluid, a meditative repetition. She didn't rush. She watched the gray dust swirl in the air, dancing in a stray beam of light. For the first time in years, the silence in the house wasn't a void. She had to fill with avoidance. It was a presence she could lean against. She wasn't fighting the house, she was inhabiting it. As the light turned to bruised gold, Amara walked out to the porch. Fatima was already there, sitting in the high-backed wicker chair, her gaze fixed on the distant peaks. The old woman looked smaller than usual, as if the act of guiding Amara had cost her a piece of her own vitality. On the small table between them lay the heavy brass ring, the metal dull and weathered, smelling of oxidized metal tang and ancient libraries. Fatima didn't look at her as she spoke. The resonance is a heavy thing to carry, Amara. Most people spend their lives running from the echoes of their fathers. You decided to build a house out of them. Amara sat on the porch steps, her hand resting on the weathered pine of the deck. She listened. The house was speaking, but the timbre had shifted. The screams of the displaced and the whispers of the forgotten had smoothed out into soft, contented sighs, like a sleeper settling into a deep dream. The house had been a vessel for unresolved grief, a museum of screams. By opening the subterranean corridor and linking the home to the community, Amara had given the secrets a place to go. They were no longer trapped in the walls, they were flowing back into the town, becoming part of the shared history rather than a private haunting. Fatima reached out and slid the brass ring across the table. The metal made a sharp singing sound as it moved. "You aren't just the carpenter anymore," Fatima said, her voice a rasping, slow cadence. "You are the protector. The house knows who holds the key to its silence." Amara picked up the ring. It was cold, then suddenly searingly hot, as if it were recognizing her skin. She didn't put it on, she simply held it in her palm, feeling the weight of it. It was a symbolic anchor, a promise that the boundary between the living and the remembered would be guarded with care. "Amara." Bao appeared at the edge of the garden, carrying a wooden tray with 2 steaming cups of tea and a plate of honeycakes. He was breathless, his cheeks flushed from the walk. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning her face with a gentle, intuitive curiosity. Amara stood up. She didn't look away. She didn't trace the grain of the porch railing or find a spot on the floor to study. She looked directly into Bao's eyes, seeing the genuine, uncomplicated kindness there. The wall she had built around herself, the one made of solitude and carefully curated distance, felt thin, almost transparent. "Thank you for not letting me stay hidden, Bao," she said. Her voice was full and clear, the sentence landing with a weight and certainty she hadn't felt since childhood. Bao beamed, a wide, radiating smile that seemed to push back the mist. "I suspected you were in there somewhere. You're just very good at blending into the woodwork." As they sat together in the deepening twilight, sharing the tea in the quiet company of Fatima, Amara felt a sudden impulse. She leaned down, pressing her ear firmly against the old floorboards of the porch. She waited. She listened for the humming, the vibrations, the gold light, or the ghostly echoes of the Okafor lineage. She waited for the house to ask for something, to warn her of a lurking threat, or to reveal another hidden room. There was nothing. No one was screaming. No one was weeping. There was only the sound of the wind in the eaves and the distant rhythmic chime of the town clock. It was an absolute, perfect silence. The house was finally at peace, and for the first time in her life, Amara realized that she was too.